So what I'll do today is just briefly introduce you to, as Darshana mentioned, my newly recently published book, A Thousand Tiny Cuts. Um, Introduce you to the book and um, its kind of point of departure, really, in the kind of in a world where there can be no doubt about the obscenities of militarized bordering in South Asia and well beyond, and increasingly militarized regimes of mobility, um, which are so normalized. Um, uh, I'll begin by saying a few things that contextualize my approach to the study of borders and borderlands and mobility in South Asia, particularly the India-Bangladesh borderlands. So that's the region in the box there where I do my work in northern Bengal. So my book and my talk today is drawn on over a decade of ethnographic fieldwork in northern Bengal, in the region, which is actually a region of multiple borderlands. You can see, while my fieldwork, my research is on the Indian-Bangladesh sides, borders with Nepal and Bhutan are not far back. And once I do that, the slides are of a number of images that pertain to the main focus of my talk today, which is that of young men coming of age. Young men, both Muslim and Rajbongshi, coming of age in these agrarian borderlands. And the gendering of mobilities as security threats in the borderlands. That's going to be the focus of my talk today. And the images are to give you, they're all images taken by me. I won't talk to them directly, but in the Q&A especially, I'm very happy to answer any questions you might have about a particular image. Okay. So my main sort of point of departure in this book, A Thousand Tiny Cuts, is to trace the history and ongoing formation of the India-Bangladesh border and national security regimes in South Asia as a relational story between India and Bangladesh. So it's not a comparative, it's not one with regards to other, but really to trace the history and ongoing formation of these of border and mobility regimes as a relational story between India and Bangladesh. India and Bangladesh, as many of you know, officially insist that the border they share is a friendly border. And this is very much the official description and line where this border is held up very much in contrast and distinction from the bad boy of the region, the India-Pakistan border, very much, sort of the hostile, conflict-prone border. But this discourse of friendliness coexists with global narratives around terror and infiltration, which in this region, in this eastern borderland, India's eastern and Bangladesh's sort of border enveloping most of Bangladesh, it coexists with global narratives of terror and infiltration and regional histories around religious politics, around majoritarian, minoritarian citizenship and religious politics. And so while the states insist that this border is friendly and it's stable and settled, we need to just look at the fence India's built along its side of the over 4,000 kilometer long border and the frequent occurrences of violence and all manner of loss of life, but also other instances of violence to know that that's not true. However, I argue in this book that uh, the fence, these kind of more spectacular instances of violence, kind of embodied, epitomized in the fence and in instances of death or violence at the hand of security forces, are really just the tip of the iceberg. Instead, I invite you in the book to grasp the visuality, the texture, and the forms of militarization that bordering brings to the agrarian ordinary. And these images give you a sense of that, what I call the agrarian ordinary of the India-Bangladesh borderlands, beyond what we can describe as either the spectacular violence of militarization or the more routinized bureaucratic political violence that militarization brings. While in the India-Bangladesh border owes its existence to partition, I argue in the book that the force of the border is not settled or invariable or fully known even. Rather, I suggest that we think of bordering as an ongoing um, and accumulative um, cutting of space, time, and imaginaries. It generates a series of hierarchical relations of value. And these hierarchical relations of value, I want us to think about them in very expansive terms. They're hierarchical relations of value of land, of crops, of men and women as brides and grooms in their respective national hinterlands. Among intimate kin in transnational families, as forms of as kinds of labor and livelihood relations, hierarchical relations of value, and bordering as these hierarchical relations of value unfold in everyday life through transnational connections in different domains. So bordering then is not a watershed event. It's not a single structure or policy. It's not a kind of infrastructural incision or scar such as the fence, but it's 1,000 tiny cuts that unfold across, unfold and become of consequence across different aspects of agrarian life. In my research, I found that that bordering is devalued and productive in all kinds of ways. And that the Indian Border Security Force and the Bangladeshi border guards are only some of the actors in the business of surveilling clandestine mobilities. Over time, I began to see how borderland residents were themselves identifying and remaking their lives and relations according to several distinctions that the border affords. The border is a risk and a resource. On days when when the price of crops was high and the price of meat low, and both India and Bangladesh winning cricket matches, granted not very often, I even heard farmers describe this as the best of both worlds. But most of the time, I learned that neither the national domain of India nor the national domain of Bangladesh offers much in isolation. Rather, the border generates a series of devaluations that hold India, what is Indian and what is Bangladeshi, together interdependently through this hierarchy of value. And this will become clear as I talk with examples. In popular imaginaries, borderlands are lawless, lawless places, criminal havens, and this is very much the way in which they appear in public political discourse on both sides, in both India and Bangladesh. And this imaginary is very evident in media discourses, in political discourse, in mainstream social perception. I found this imaginary to be very much at work um, in not just policing by state actors, but also the way in which neighbors, various actors in, school teachers, related to one another, especially to borderland residents from various border villages. And what I want to shift to now talking about is one of the aspects of life, one of the domains in life that I found this criminalizing imaginary to be acutely present, is in the gendered production of male mobility as a security threat, right? So one of the aspects, this is one of the aspects of life in which we see the relational hierarchy of value play out in terms of gendered mobility, the way in which mobilities are considered threatening or not. And this is very much, in the backdrop, again, as we all know, as this impossible task of sorting citizens out from migrants, migrants out from bona fide refugees, has really taken over our political vocabulary, our political imaginary in India. The search for the illegal immigrant means synonymous with Muslim, Bengali figure, often male, but variously gendered. Has become really dominant. And while that vicious discourse has extreme material consequences across India and Bangladesh and in the borderlands, um, I want to take you to the borderlands today to talk about a different kind of gendered figure of threat, and that is of the rural working class male migrant cast as a threat to the city and nation's modernity in both sides, right? Um, and uh, and sort of the conditions which produce risk for the young men coming of age in the borderlands, as they think about various livelihood decisions in their lives. Let me dig deeper into what I mean with two portraits. I'm going to share two portraits with you today. So, first, Alum. Alom Hussain is one of those who have not left the borderlands. And I was frequently told by many that, the borderlands are, as an example of this kind of criminalizing imaginary of the borderlands. Um, I was often told that, oh, the borderlands are a, terrible place. They're a criminal, that's full of criminals. Anyone by which they mean, young people, especially young men, anyone who has promise and who doesn't want to be associated with this criminality or the illegal economies of the border, leave. Right. So all the young with promise leave. And by that argument, by that association, all those who haven't left are criminal. Alom Hossein is one who has not left. In Alom's words, we have to try our chances here. Education, Lekha Pora, is not for people like us. We neither have any patron nor that much money that we can buy a job. So only education will not fill up your stomach. What else to do? You must feed your household, must keep trying here, meaning the borderlands. Being scared will get you nowhere. You have to use your brains and you must understand how things work here. Alom philosophizes in this way on the ends and means of education for unconnected rural poor like himself, while we chat near his family's home in Bibiganj, a border village in Bangladesh. He was portrayed as the black sheep in his family. His older brother Ashraf ran a small pawn shop just by the auto stand in the village, and he kept phones with Indian SIMs that people could use to make and receive calls for a small charge. I had been directed to his services once when my Indian SIM was not working, as I was living in that border village, and we had struck up a lively conversation and a friendship. I often went to his shop in the evenings to chat. Now, Ashraf Bhai, the older brother, had never left this larger Greater Rangpur region of northern Bangladesh, but he rattled off names of northern Indian places with great familiarity. These were not well known towns, and often I didn't recognize the names of these places. Ashraf Bhai explained that these were all names of places that the callers on his Indian phones were living in as migrant workers. And these were, men from Bibiganj who were migrant workers in these places. They would call to speak to or leave messages for their family members. Um, as I got to know this family, Ashraf Bhai always spoke of his younger brother, Alum, apologetically, saying that he was not doing so well. Ashraf was determined to send him to what he said, Delhi, kind of placeholder umbrella term for northern India, through one of the many good contacts he had developed through his phone business. One evening, he held up, one of these old blue Nokia phones in his hand, and he said, my friend in Shiliguri has been there for so long that he's become a labor contractor and has his own house now, and he's always offering to send Alom there, and has given his word to take care of Alom. But Alom was not going to be sent, thus clandestinely crossing the border to India. And if we recall his words, he's quite clear and firm about, imagining a life for himself and his family in the borderlands. On another day, when I broached this possibility of migrating to work to work in northern India, he lashed out in protest. I quote, "Why go to do Bideshe Golami, what I translate as servitude in another country, when I can do something here? If I must take all kinds of risks, dunya jhuki, I might as well take them here, sitting in my own house, eating food, rice, bari bhat, eating food in from my own home. The borderlands of India and Bangladesh, I want to suggest, are actually full of aloms. It's a place with the young that the young with promise leave, and therefore the young who remain are by that circular logic, by that kind of criminalizing, policing logic, considered to be bokhate, the term, so the wasted or rotten, by both state and society. The burden of this alleged dangerous criminality located in the space of the rural borderland rests squarely on the shoulders of young men like Alom. Um, those who remain or who return, like Alom and Shobuj, who I'll talk about in just a bit, and try to eke out a living in the agrarian borderlands, become the prime targets of security forces and law enforcement agencies, but also in social norms and discourses around acceptable clandestine mobility. So discourses of contagion and criminality, as we know, manifest in very particular gendered categories of intervention. They're not disembodied at all. Quite to the contrary, they're embodied in very particularly gendered categories of intervention. The Bokhate Chele in the borderlands is one such gendered figure. In Bangladesh, the discourse is of Indian drugs targeting not only Bangladeshi youth with addiction, but also turning them into criminals. So, nation, we see how if the figure of the border crossing migrant is the figure of threat, gender threat in India, it's the Bokhate Chele, particularly the drug smuggler, the drug seller, and the drug consumer. That's the figure of gender threat in Bangladesh. And so we see how nation centered analyses make produce these figures in a very relational way, right? Where the threat is located, where the threat is coming from, what kind of border crossing mobility produces that threat. Spatializing the borderlands as dangerous and borderland youth as simultaneously vulnerable and dangerous. In northern Bangladesh, while I was living and doing field work in 2015, a 15-year-old, here's another instance of the manifestation of this kind of discourse of contagion and criminality. A 15-year-old girl boldly asked the SP of police of this borderline district of Lalmonirhat, I quote, there are a lot of drug addicts in our society and a lot of drug sellers in the borderlands. How do we stop them? The SP was in her school on that day as part of a drive to reform vulnerable youth, in which the district police was reaching out to students in high schools, colleges, and madrasas. To the hall full of about more than 100 schoolgirls, he described a familiar type of social miscreant, the Bokhate Chele, or the corrupted male youth. I quote the SP as he described, how this Bokhate Chele. He resembles a dog with heavy chains and bracelets around his neck and wrists. He has streaks of color in his spiky gelled hair, cigarette in his fingers or dangling out of the corner of his mouth as he stands leaning sideways fashionably. That's the Bokhate Chele for you, standing around your school on your route back home, trying to impress you. They usually take drugs. They often have drugs on them. I usually beat them up when I catch them. After that, sending them to court only means that they will get out on bail by giving money. So I shame them. Sometimes I call their parents and I shame them and their parents together. And then he went on to boast about how his team instructed to show no mercy towards such Bokhate Chele who were threats to national security, to Jatiyo Jibon, to the sort of national safety and life. Had picked up a certain number of Bokhate Chele, and he then proceeded to invite these schoolgirls to help him catch more of these Bokhate Chele. I quote, together we have to make them stand up straight. We have to do this for a better society, for our country. So the police chief's invitation encouraged all students drawn from either this very same borderline district of Lalmonirhat or surrounding border villages to fix their gaze upon their peers, their brothers, their neighbors in this criminalizing fashion. And his contention was that they would have to be reformed with deterring violence if necessary, for the sake of a kind of better, safer social national life. Um, Second portrait, Shobuj. Shobuj was 22 when I first met him back in 2014. Crazy, 10 years ago. He is the third of seven brothers in a Muslim family with very little land and lives in a border village on the Indian side. So actually not very far from Bibiganj where Alom lives. When I asked him what he and his brothers did, especially his older brothers, he said, "Babsha kore." They do business. His glance clearer than his words. Um, in Shobuj's words of how he got involved, I was 15, I was still studying in school. I didn't ask for it. One night, my brother, who worked in the cattle business, couldn't go. And he sent me as his replacement. So this, young men often work in transporting cattle that are smuggled across the border from India to Bangladesh. I had to transport a pair of cows all the way up to the border. I came home with cash in my hands. Uh, that's how I got entangled. This was quite simply Shobuj's story of his initiation. Um Shobuj's parents are elderly. His two older brothers who have married must now stay engaged in the borders businesses, particularly with cash economies, to earn enough cash to keep their households running. Keenly aware of how cash flows from the Dunamburi border economy and transition to being a householder with financial responsibilities can become entangled, Shobuj uh, then and every time we talked, very quietly insisted that he didn't want to marry until he had found a stable source of income, by which he meant something that was dissociated from the clandestine economies of the border. One afternoon, I accompanied Shobuj and his friends as they bought their goods, cosmetics for one of them and a large carton of Lay's potato chips for the other, from wholesalers in Dinhata, which was the largest sort of town in that border area. Um, they were grappling with the different scales at which Babsha business unfolded and and trying to see where they fitted into that, what quite literally in terms of capital and profits, but also in terms of risks of protection and safety. They were going to transport these items, cosmetics and potato chips, in quite small quantities across the border to their partners in a village I called Madhupur on the Bangladesh side. They were supplying them to small stores in shops in border villages, and were going to make a small amount of profit on per item. We sat in the back of a shared vehicle as we came back to the border village from Dinhata, the town. Shobuj raised his voice above the wind, the motor, and the passenger chatter, and he said, "What I do is petty business, kuchro babsha. I don't have the capital for anything more than this." And he joked, if I could only go to the bank and say, "Give me a loan for my group, please," that would solve all my problems. And he and his friends laughed very loudly at this because they knew that I often accompanied, I had a lot of friends who were in women's self-help groups, which is very much, as we all know, the sort of darling of the developmental world and also hugely successful, run by the state government in West Bengal, but also, very, very prevalent on the Bangladesh side. And so women's groups get small loans as credit for various kinds of businesses from both private and state lending sources. Yes, why don't you help us get a loan? Amrao স্বনির্ভর হতে চাই. We also want to be self-sufficient, they all, joked. While much has been written about this in both Bangladesh and West Bengal, by focusing exclusively on women, it puts rural men entirely outside the system of financial networks. Across the borderland, young men compared the differences, so young men coming of age very much compared the differences they learned about between credit systems in India and Bangladesh, between the ways in which gendered coming of age, being young men and young women, in before marriage, as young people in marriages with small children, so as householders, how these impacted options, livelihood options, gender norms, familial relations, and women's expectations of men in families. Eventually turning serious over a cold drink at the auto stand at the end of our ride, Shobuj continued to speak, to reflect on the scale of his business and the risks, kind of weighing the risks and advantages, profits of his business. I quote, "I don't like this Bakir Babsha, this business of credit. It's very complicated to recover money from Bangladesh, and my networks are not so strong. I'm quite insignificant," he reflected. "So I only do straightforward transactions, chocolates, chips, creams, all in small quantities. But that limits me because and he meant that limited him in the kind of money he could make. And I don't like this in any case." As his friends left, Shobuj continued to share that uh, a boy got shot in the arm right next to me while we were swimming across the river to Bangladesh in the darkness of the night with plastic wrapped bundles of ganja. That boy is still living with pieces of shrapnel in his arm. Gesturing to the back of his arm, Shobuj looked past me kind of darkly as he spoke. "This happened 2 winters ago, and I became afraid of my life. So I stopped this business of the night. Now I only do the small stuff during the day." So we see how risks of border security and associated gains cut quite literally very close to the skin. After about a year of such petty business, though, and so Shobuj comes to doing this petty business already through a series of decisions and weighing the considerations of risk and profit in the borderlands. After about a year of such petty business, Shobuj had concluded that it was just simply not profitable enough to provide the necessary capital that he aspired to in order to set up a stable business, probably a shop, and he would have to seek such income elsewhere. The allure, the draw of kacha taka or cash is tremendous. It's undeniable that it's tremendous for teenage boys and young men in the borderlands. On either side, you could spot a boom seasonally during the monsoons or with specific commodities that were in demand on either side being transported when a particular route was open. You could spot this, you could spot the upswing in border businesses by the groups of energetic boys in new jeans and sunglasses hanging out in the cool music shops of the village bazaar, their smartphones luminous in the darker alleyways and bazaar corners. But while this kancha taka belittled as easy money, uh, widely socially, buys some of the accoutrements of youth masculinity and allows them to be stylish for a while, it seldom consolidates a transition to mature masculinity. Boobs eventually bust, and no sooner than these young men and their households start enjoying the cash, they are without any. After that, they try their hand in various businesses of the border economy, variously risky and variously profitable, and then often turn to taking on the risks of migration. On the Indian side, the Border Security Force very clearly understood the temporality of this economic desperation and actively operationalized that in their strategies. In other words, they intended their unsparing security surveillance practices to be so vicious that it would literally be too risky, physically risky for young men to remain engaged in Babsha in the borderlands, and they would be, they would be forced to flee. They would be forced to leave the borderlands they do and be pushed into migrant work in construction or manufacturing, for instance. So Shoboj's portrait of decision making around livelihoods makes amply clear that Delhi, referred to on both sides as an option, and the borderlands are not disconnected at all, but are highly connected economies with money and multiple forms of value and considerations of risk, calculus of risk flowing in both directions. Young men earn in one to invest in or further interests in another. Risk was embodied, risk is seasonal, risk was a feature of work in Delhi, Risk is a feature of daily calculation in farming in the agrarian borderlands. And for many of these young men, choosing not to farm is as much a kind of um, social normative understanding of what kind of labor, what kind of physical toil is attractive, but it's also very much a calculation of risk. And the way in which farming has become the payoff in risk and profit in farming has become heavily loaded in the side of being unprofitable. So, such a connected calculus of risk and danger that stretches spatially across these locations makes the conceptual boundaries between formal, informal, legal, illegal, borderland, sort of hinterland national body politic questionable, particularly in relation to male mobility. This connected geography of risk in becoming a successful and mature man in the borderlands surfaces what feminist scholars call the scattered hegemonies of gender, class, caste, and religious identity, and the hierarchical value of the national, right? So the value of the national, quite literally in terms of a currency, in terms of national economies, in terms of labor markets, produces the kinds of options available in very gendered terms. In subsequent conversations, Shobuj refused to answer my questions about fun in the city. And I would, based actually on a lot of scholarship that, one has read about perhaps an earlier generation of migrants, rural to urban migrants, I would ask lots of questions about, what do you do for fun in the city? How do you, what kinds of friendships, networks have you built, and so on. But Shobuj and several other young men from both Indian and Bangladeshi border villages rarely answered questions, would rarely take me up on my invitations to talk about their time in city as fun. I found that migration was lauded by very few. It was very clearly described as a necessary evil. New and veteran migrants across these borderlands emphasized that migration was risky. Here or there, wherever they were from, wherever they lived, in the majority and especially in the minority, being identifiable as a minority, so as a Bengali Muslim, away from the borderlands was in itself very risky. Their narratives echo a profound ambivalence that scholars Dolly Kikon and Bengt Carlson find more recently have also found among excuse me, among indigenous migrants from India's northeast as they leave their lands but remain what they call, what Kikon and Carlson call, stretched across multiple places. This ambivalent stretching for Bengali Muslims is fraught and exhausting and needs to be understood even more specifically. As borderland Bengali migrants, both Indian and Bangladeshi are repeatedly attacked in locales across India with allegations of being illegal migrants, and that vulnerability exploited in labor relations, their identities are collapsed, right? So whether it becomes immaterial, whether they're truly Indian or truly Bangladeshi, but their identities are really collapsed in that of a Bengali Muslim figure. So while this is happening through attacks on these figures across Delhi, destinations where these migrants are often working in, young men are often working in, internal differentiations, especially that of nationality, actually harden even more, right? So even as they are collapsed into this homogeneous category, internal, these men strive to really differentiate amongst themselves even more as a measure of protection or sort of imagined protection and distinction. So, bordering, we can see through these examples, very clearly establishes a relationship between risk and value. In devaluing some spaces and some bodies, it makes risk profitable. সব দিকেই ঝুঁকি আছে. There is risk in every direction or in every way. Young men shared this repeatedly, I heard this. সব দিকেই ঝুঁকি আছে. A conclusion, a lament, a critique, an expectation, and a diagnosis. For instance, the riskier it is to cross the border to transport goods such as ganja or cattle, the more profitable it is in immediate terms of cash payouts. In another calculus, with increased border security, um, it becomes too risky to cross the border often. And so a lot of men working in other parts, across the border may choose to stay away from the borderlands and take other risks in their work, whatever sector they're working in order to defer border crossing. So throughout my research, and this is, I very much draw on this EMIC, this term that young men themselves use to kind of make sense of this calculus of risk and value. Jhuki emerge not only as a term that they use, risk emerges as a term they use, but as an epistemological concept. So as a term with which they very much analyze and diagnose the structural conditions under which these uh, seemingly disconnected economies and spaces are very much connected. Across the world, those who work in what is branded as illegal or underground economies are widely considered to be criminals in statist and socio-legal terms. And we see this very much play out here in Northern Bengal. But what I want to emphasize that in Northern Bengal, it's the gendered criminalization of the borderlands, and it's young men as either smugglers and criminals or predatory migrants in cities that invites the violence of militarized policing in what is resolutely described as a friendly border, right? So not all residents of borderlands are equally, not all clandestine mobilities in borderlands are equally, the policing are equally sanctioned. The gendered production of male migrants, male border crossers as a security threat actually finds social sanction as well. So this lens of security, whether adopted by the state or more broadly by national publics, um, seeks to fix risk and danger in the mobile bodies of borderland men, lower caste, Muslim, and laboring working class bodies. So I invite you to step back and consider such a lens itself as an expansive, ongoing process of bordering. This view can reveal the deep cut such bordering makes and how it normalizes the most spectacular violence that then comes to be directed at the much maligned figure of the illegal migrant. But I sort of want to foreground this larger sort of, not just context, but larger, very important set of agrarian economies within which the spectacular violence that we see erupt at bodies, Bengali Muslim bodies, threatened, alleged to be illegal migrants, in what relationship that is produced and becomes possible. So while the Indian and Bangladeshi states insist that this is a friendly border between two friendly and equal neighbors, we can see how it normalizes this less spectacular form of militarization in everyday agrarian life, and even conscripts sort of residents into participating in these regimes of policing and securitization. Residents on both sides of the borderlands face similar structural disadvantages, though they experience them quite differently. And one of the images that's been coming along is that of halogen lights on Indian side of the border, put up by the Indian security state, that shine only in one direction, drawing insects to the banana fields owned by Bangladeshi farmers on the other side. And as residents on the Bangladeshi side pointed in that village pointed out to me that of course, we may have all kinds of intimate connections, but the face of the light points in only one direction. And so even when they shared experiences, I think it's a very sort of poignant way in which residents separated by distinctions and hierarchies of national identity seldom make common cause. National frames come in between, fracturing possible transnational solidarities, and that is perhaps one of the deepest cuts of bordering. as a kind of relational hierarchy of value. With such developments, it's even more urgent, I argue, to take a transnational approach, as I do, to political economy, to examining the construction of the male migrant as a security threat and locus of national anxiety in ways that allow us to reimagine the connected politics of migrant illegality across the political economy of this agrarian region. In this regional political economy, risk is nationalized. Um, Even as the pressures of masculine becoming in a distressed agrarian world are interwoven with the risks introduced by militarization, right? Um, Depeasantization, migration, immobility, these are all structural and material conditions that are constituted transnationally across the borderlands. And we can see that really come to life in the experiences of Shobuj and Alom, for instance. So my transnational feminist approach to bordering in this book, and in the examples I've given you today, uh, really centers this relation, the emergence of these relational hierarchies, whether of men and women as daily wage workers, whether at the scale of India and Bangladesh as separated markets and economies, um, or of, as in the case that I've talked about today, of Bengali Muslim masculinity, a Muslim and low caste masculinity and mobility as a national security threat, counterposed very much with the vulnerability of women, very differently for Hindu women and for Muslim women, which are, these kinds of relational distinctions make certain devaluations of mobility possible and certain others to become permissible at different scales. Um, a story told from the borderlands, I hope, shows most clearly how political economic questions of land, resources, and the exploitation of labor are rooted through the lens of national security regimes in our contemporary world. This is that image with the halogen lights on the Indian side, pointing in such a way that attracts insects to banana gardens you see in the foreground on the Bangladeshi side. And so, it's, even though one can talk about, we see in a very material manifestation of how national distinctions become very real and make common cause or solidarity quite hard to imagine when they're very clearly the national difference is so materially consequential, as in this image. Um, and I hope to invite, and I would love a conversation around this, is that gendered bodies and mobilities uh, don't only feel the effects of militarized bordering, but militarized bordering and the practices of security and surveillance, and more pervasively of these what I call relations of value, of devaluation, actually take shape through gendered norms and ideas and gendered relations, right? So gendered bodies don't just feel the effect, but they are central, they are constitutive of the relations of value that bordering, sort of unfold, that bordering um, takes shape through. The cuts of bordering separate and debilitate such that solidarities across these multiple kinds of distinctions are hard to imagine. And the fraught intimacies and unruly connections that I share in the book, and that I, hope to invoke through juxtaposing portraits such as that of Alom and Shobuj, who don't know each other, but we can see in juxtaposing their lives the way in which the conditions, their decisions, their predicaments are really interrelated. And I hope thinking in this transnational connected way in terms of relationality will push us all to think, question, and organize value beyond the categories of the national. And I'll stop with that.